Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Stan Trent, and I am moderating this, what will be a real treat for you, a wonderful presentation about equity through inclusion, embracing cultural and linguistic diversity. So we have distinguished panelists with us who are going to present for us today. We have Dr. Gerald Campano, who will be speaking with us. And we also have Leah Dozier Walker, who will be speaking with us, and also Kibiriti Majuto, who will be speaking to us about the work that they are doing that addresses diversity in research, in policy, and also in advocacy. So first of all, we are going to have Dr. Campano talk to us and give us a flash talk for about 5 to 7 minutes about his work. So Gerald, I'll hand it over to you at this point.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Professor Trent, for that introduction. And I have a film I'm going to show that I am going to talk over, which is about a research practice partnership. So today I want to share a little bit about a research practice partnership between myself, students and colleagues primarily at the University of Pennsylvania, and families connected to St. Thomas Aquinas Parish in South Philadelphia. The purpose of the partnership has been to support a community-based research center where youth and families investigate issues of educational equity and justice. It aspires to be a research center housed in the community and a research center for the community. The partnership began 10 years ago when my partner in life and research, Dr. Maria Paula Giso from Columbia Teachers College, and I attended a Know Your Rights workshop hosted by the New Sanctuary Movement, a grassroots immigrant rights organization. The majority of the audience were from the Indonesian Christian community who escaped sectarian violence and were historically targeted for genocide in their home country. But once in the US, they were targeted by immigration and ICE for being from a predominantly Muslim country. After sharing poignant testimonials of family separation, the Indonesian priest, one of the community leaders, said, "Education is what gives our community hope." When the leaders in the community found out that Maria Paula and I were from immigrant backgrounds ourselves, I am a German Filipino with ancestral roots in the Mindanao region of the Philippines, and Maria is an immigrant from South America. They opened up the possibility of creating a partnership together. We spent a year or two just supporting initiatives in the community and building trust before doing research together. Over the past decade, hundreds of community members have been involved, as well as scores of students from Penn. What has been most edifying about the partnership? For one, it is participatory. It is about doing research alongside rather than on people. Research on issues that the community themselves deem most urgent to their aspirations. It is also coalitional, fostering solidarity across cultural, linguistic, racialized, and institutional boundaries. We have had involvement from the Indonesian, Latinx, Concerned Black Catholic, and Vietnamese communities, among others. It is intergenerational. It involves young children and elders to everyone in between, especially middle and high school youth. This is important because there are long colonial histories of separating children from their families, which occurs in spectacularly violent ways, such as on the border, but also in more subtle ways through schooling. Together, we developed ethical and professional norms for our community-based research. These norms include the presumption of equality, that everyone is an intellectual and everyone is brilliant. And in particular, it recognizes the epistemic privilege of minoritized communities, the knowledge and perspectives born out of historical struggles for social justice and equity. The research is also committed to co-constructing every aspect of the research agenda together, making sure that the research benefits the community, And we are also committed to making the research public in transparent, collaborative, and creative ways, hence the video you are watching. Over the years, the researchers have investigated a number of issues related to educational equity and access, including how schools can develop partnerships with families, the importance of attending to the whole child through the arts and enrichment programs, and making sure that there are adequate numbers of school counselors. All of these things have been slashed in Philadelphia due to budget cuts. Making things like advanced placement classes available to all, the importance for all teachers to get trained in anti-racist and culturally relevant pedagogy, issues of language access, and making sure that ties are severed between ICE and the Philadelphia police, and making sure that ICE stays away from schools. And these students have even investigated the material realities of education, including in Philadelphia, toxic school infrastructure that is infested with lead, asbestos, and rodents in schools that resemble prisons more than nurturing learning environments. The youth and families have gone public with their research in a number of ways. They have presented, as you can see, at a number of professional conferences, including the American Educational Research Association, where the room was too small, so they quote unquote occupied the hallway, presenting to hundreds of people. The University of Pennsylvania Ethnography Forum, the National Council for the Teachers of English Conference, and more. They have also presented to their own communities in the neighborhood and local educators, and they have published academic articles. There is one 10th grader who has more scholarly publications than I did into my 3rd year as an assistant professor. We still have many more goals. Maria Paula and I always tell the community members that we are committed to doing this work together unless they don't want us anymore, our family has to move for some compelling reason, or we become too sick or pass away. This is because this is not just about research. This is about relationships. This is about equity and social justice. One of our main goals right now is to develop professional development for educators around issues of educational equity and access from families' perspectives. We are also co-writing a professional development book together with around 20 authors from the community, from young children to high school youth to elders. But I think where I would like to end is that over the past decade, I do believe we have created an alternative educational community together, decolonial in its aspirations, premised on, quoting Audre Lorde, the interdependence of non-dominant differences. As scholars such as Bell Hooks have noted, most justice movements have love as essential to their work. This is not a corrupted love that excludes others, such as the way that love of country is invoked by politicians to stigmatize those who are most vulnerable, such as immigrants. Rather, it is a love that embraces multiplicity, difference, intersectionality, and Congress, breaking bread together. Although this work has certainly not without its tensions and challenges, our research community has strived to prefigure the world we hope will come about.
Thank you so much, Gerald. One of the things that I want to say is that when I think about all of the presenters today, is that they are confronting master narratives. We will see that from the realm of research, advocacy, and policy. We see that there are master narratives, but for so many years, we have counter narratives that are never heard, that have been silenced for generations. One of the things I say is that where there is voice, there is also silence. And so one of the things that our people are doing today is to elevating that silence and that counter narrative to a point where it is heard, it is acknowledged, heard, acknowledged, and employed to bring about social justice and equity for disenfranchised, minoritized groups. So, so Gerald has talked, given his flash talk, and now I want to introduce the other presenters, and all three of them will talk to us for about 35 minutes about their work. So we have with us Kibiriti Majuto, and Kibiriti is going to talk about his work as a community organizer and advocate for disenfranchised groups in the community. And also we have with us Leah Dozier Walker, as I've introduced already, who is currently the Director for Equity and Community Engagement at the Virginia Department of Education, where she leads statewide efforts aimed at advancing education equity, closing the achievement gap, and decreasing disproportionality in student outcomes. So we are excited to hear you all talk about your work to elevate the counter narratives. Kibiriti, would you like to start?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. So my name is Kibiriti, and I'm a student, a senior at William & Mary. And I think that when we hear of cultural competency, the first thing that comes to mind for me, it's always been grounded in community, like getting to know the community that especially an educator lives in, the people, the students, and getting to know the community like a little bit better firsthand, like how those relationships like. And my work in here at William & Mary as an intern with the Village Institute is working to get the school district to realize that we need a cultural competency that's grounded in community, where teachers actually get to know the students they're working with, and so on. And so part of the things that I'm doing is basically building a equity report, providing suggestion on what things, practical things the school can do to actually get teachers out and get to know the community they're working with. So that's just a little bit of what I do right now, and I've been doing this semester.
Okay, thank you so much, Kibiriti. And one of the things I forgot to mention is that if you all have questions, please send them through the chat room. And if we have time at the end, we will fill those questions and give you the opportunity to hear more from our presenters. All right, Leah. You're muted.
That is the phrase of 2020. Good afternoon, everyone. Leah Walker. I'm the Director of Equity at the Department of Education. And really in my role, I'm tasked with developing and implementing a statewide strategy that will support the advancement of equity outcomes for students across the Commonwealth. For us, we really have been strategic and intentional in the way that we approach this work at the state level, beginning with how we've defined education equity. And so we define education equity as eliminating the predictability of student outcomes based on certain demographic variables. And that's really based on what we see in terms of inequities in the system of public education. And then from there, really developing a framework, a theory of change that we believe will support and advance equity outcomes for students. So for us, you know, there's lots of different ways you can think about equity, but what we have decided to do at DOE is really focus on outcomes and then evaluate and support the inputs that impact those outcomes. And so we can talk more about that as the conversation evolves, and what role specifically cultural proficiency and cultural competency play in our broader strategy to advance education outcomes for students in Virginia.
Okay, so thank you very much, Leah. And Gerald, would you have something to add? to the mix?
First and foremost, I just want to say what an honor it is to be on this panel with you, Professor Trent, with Leah, with Kibiriti. And I think, you know, one of the exciting things is that we're all kind of committed to equity and social justice, but we're doing this work kind of from different institutional locations, whether it's the university, whether it's the school district, whether it's the community. And I think probably many of us are working across these different, you know, social and cultural boundaries together. And I think that's powerful because we do need to create a common strategy, a common vision of educational equity and access, you know, for students and for families. And I think one of the challenges is how do we move beyond our silos, and how do we get, for example, people talking to one another, people who are working with teachers and training them to be in conversation with leaders in the school district, to be in conversations with teachers, to be in conversation with youth and families and elders and grassroots activist organizations. And that's a tremendous kind of complex challenge, but I think it's important to really bring people together across these boundaries. So I would love to hear my colleagues' thoughts on some of those issues.
One thing that I would add here is that I would encourage the audience to begin to think the way that you just described, Gerald, that we need to look at state departments of education where policies are made. People work so hard to develop policies and put them in place, and then to actually support those who are implementing the reforms in their schools. So you think about, if you're in the community or you are a researcher, you need to start thinking about and connecting with people at the State Department level, the policymakers, right? So if you're a researcher, then you need to, if you're an advocate, then you need to do the same thing. If you're a researcher, you need to do the same thing. Stop thinking, get out of what, Gerald, what you talked about, get out of the silos, right? And then pull resources together. But at the same time, don't do it from a patriarchal standpoint. Don't do it where your master narrative is the narrative that is always the focus. As you come together, you have to invite those people who have not had a voice to come in, to respect what they have to say, to utilize what it is that they have to say as you create the policies, as you create the research, as you create the community, the strategies that you will use in the community to bring about change. Very important.
One of the things that strikes me just in the context of this conversation is sort of like the connection between, or rather the disconnect between the academy, right? So like research, schools of education, other social science research institutions, and then community-based organizations where, so like passion is driving their interest and their advocacy on an issue. And that may be true too in the academy, but there certainly seems to be at times a really significant disconnect between what is being researched and what we need to be researched in order to solve real, you know, present day problems. And so I was just on another meeting before this with a Virginia School of Education, really thinking about how can we be more intentional and strategic about building some alignment between the area of research and its application to practice in the actual field. How do we build relationships that extend the opportunities for researchers to engage and inform public policy making in real time? And I think that is a challenge that we're often presented with as policymakers. Many people think, you know, like a bill becomes a law and it gets implemented, right? Somehow magically it happens, but really it's public administrators, it's officials in agencies that decide how those policies get implemented, and whether or not we embed within those implementation structures, regulations, rules, policies, procedures, right, an equity mindset and an equity lens to ensure that the intended goal of the policy is actually achieved. And so those are a lot of the challenges, and I think that there's a great deal of opportunity for increased engagement of sort of the advocacy community and the research community to better inform that work at the policy delivery level.
Do you have any ideas about how we can accomplish?
Well, I do think forums like this certainly create space and place for relationship building. I do think, I'm not a member of the Academy. I proudly say that. I'm just, I'm just a bureaucrat.
Proudly say that.
Just a bureaucrat. But what I would say is that, I think that there's sometimes like a person, like there's a little bit of intimidation in dealing with the Academy. And sort of that perceived expertise that's there. And in some ways, I think there is a reticence sometimes to be told what your research agenda should be, right? Like, I think that members and researchers and scholars, they want to decide for themselves. And I appreciate that sincerely. I just think we have some really real problems that we need to be able to address. And it's gonna take the combination of advocacy, policymakers, researchers to get it right so that we're not still spinning our wheels, right, 200 years from now.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
I think also the fact that within that research, as Leah was pointing out to the importance of relationship and including the community, as we see in Pennsylvania, the community are the knowledge producers that tell the research what's going on, right? So I feel like realizing that the community can play a very, very important role in formulating the outcomes of research, and just producing that knowledge that can inform policy can be very, very central, and including young people, be participant observers of what's going on within their own school. They are very active in school. So what can we gain from students in shaping our understanding of how education policy and outcomes can look like in the near future? And that's something that's really, really, I'm very glad to see that experience in Pennsylvania and that playing out at the university level, but it's very, very unique.
Yeah, I just want to echo, I really appreciate what both Leah and Kibiriti mentioned. Part of my project, and there are many other people in the Academy are doing this, is, not many, I should say, it's still not the dominant approach to research, but it's really about democratizing knowledge production and really democratizing expertise. I was a school teacher before I entered the Academy for 10 years. And I taught in very, under-resourced contexts. And professional development often looked like, okay, you're gonna have an afternoon off and we're gonna herd all of you into a big room, and there's gonna be an expert there who might have the latest knowledge about something like brain research says about reading. And it was very much a transmission model. It was very much like all the knowledge was constructed, by some researcher in the Academy, and it was transmitted to us, and we had to kind of execute it faithfully, right? But I was lucky when I went to graduate school to work with scholars who were invested in things like practitioner research and the teacher research movement. And it suggested that so many ideas and so many of the most, just like Leah is saying, so many of the most pressing questions about education can really arise organically from the day-to-day in classrooms, from the thick of things, right? So it's not just a question that's found in some literature review, like some missing piece of some literature review, but these are really real pressing questions. And then I think adding on to Kibiriti, what I really found is just how incredible when the families and the community members and the young people are engaged in research, and they're doing amazing research. I mean, they're publishing it and presenting on it in academic journals, but often they're identifying issues way before, researchers are and investigative reporters are. And just to give one example, and I mentioned this briefly in the opening talk, but our young people really wanted to investigate the material realities of schooling. And they uncovered and discussed things like the toxic asbestos and lead poisoning in Philadelphia schools, rodent infestations, you know, how schools resemble more prisons than nurturing learning environments, the lack of counselors, the lack of enrichment programs. And then years after they did this original research, interviewing people, finding primary sources, presenting at it in conferences, using critical literacy, critical race theory as a conceptual framework, the Philadelphia Inquirer years later wrote about these same issues, like but they knew that they were on the ground, and based on their lived experiences, based on the intellectual and activist legacies in their communities, they could do very powerful research. I think where we're struggling now, I think we're going to make some steps in being able to do professional development with teachers, but I do feel like, where we're having trouble is how to even reach policymakers and the realm of policy. That seems so distant to us, and that's why, to me, it's just so heartening, and I get so much optimism knowing that, people like Leah Walker are, at the highest levels, really making profound changes and really honoring the voices of everyone involved.
Mm-hmm. A beautiful thing, a beautiful thing. Leo, did you want to add to that?
Well, I just want to say that I think this space around like education equity in particular, right? Like equity is a big thing. It's like you can talk about it all over the place. And it has lots of different intersectionalities around equity. But when we're talking about education equity in particular, it's really actually like an emerging field of practice, right? Like a sophisticated public education system hasn't really existed for that long. Schools were only integrated in Virginia, at least about 60 years ago. So when we're really having these conversations about how do we disrupt and dismantle those things that were put in place to perpetuate inequity in an education system, which were all intentionally designed to do so, it's an emerging field of practice, which means that there's a great deal of opportunity for different types of collaboration and partnerships to inform the development of good, sound public policy to address these issues. Unlike other things, right? Like if we want to talk about reading and the science of reading, there's like probably 100 years worth of research on that. And you can pull your favorite one and craft your narrative based on what it is you want the outcome to be. But when we're talking about this space, it's an emerging field of practice, and that's exciting. And it's daunting because sometimes we feel like we're making it up as we go along, even though we have the best intentions to be informed by research and best practice and scholars and writing. But it's a challenge, particularly when it comes to using quantifiable data to substantiate public policy recommendations in the space of education equity. That's not always readily available. We can see the problem really clearly as evidenced in data. We can't always get to a place though where we can see evidence of interventions, strategies, and policies that have positively impacted those outcomes. And so I think that's where the greatest opportunity is.
And I think one thing that we need to acknowledge when we're doing this work, we need to acknowledge the endemic nature of racism. It has always been here, as you said, Leah, and it will always be here. So it's no point, I think, in trying to create these policies and reforms and doing this research if we don't acknowledge that. And if those in power don't acknowledge that they have to have a shift in their thinking about who is the most intelligent, the social construction of race, who has the power to make the decisions for everyone. That has to change if all of the things that you all are talking about are going to really become a part of the day-to-day life in schools, right? In communities. I have a question for Kibiriti. And let's see, where is it? Where is it? Okay, Matt has sent me 100 questions. Okay, Kibiriti, they would like for you to speak a bit more about your work with the Virginia Student Power Network and how that work is stimulating more awareness of what can be done to include the cultural and linguistically diverse student.
Great. Yeah, so Virginia Student Power Network is a network of student organizers from across the Commonwealth, from different universities, working on just making Virginia more equitable in terms of like economic, social, and other form of like inequities that are out there within our university spaces. So currently most of our work is focused on universities, because universities are also pillars that uphold very systematic roots of oppression, and a lot of the problems that we see facing our school systems also really grounded in our own universities that choose to enforce these very weird ways understanding of like knowledge production and so on, like who's considered intelligent. And so most of our work right now has now been focused on cultural and linguistic diversity, mostly around like economic inequalities within our school systems, and how that's impacting like Black and brown workers, and how can we advocate for schools to be more just in Black and brown students and basically achieving the goals. But there have been campaigns across different schools to address like the racism aspect of our school. UVA is a great example where student rose up, like fighting against Nazis, and so on. And so, but that's basically a little bit of what we are doing right now. And we also do electoral work in deciding like who do we want being representing us, and how can we hold our own boards of visitors accountable for the work that they do, and educating students about the power structures that it's a very business model, our university system structures. And so how can we shift that to be more democratic and student oriented, so that we can achieve the goals that we want without having like CEOs and so on making the decisions for at the university levels. That's basically what we do right now.
Wonderful work, wonderful work. I think one of the things too is getting back to what Gerald and Leah, what you said is that we need to, those of us in the academy, we need to think about why we do the research that we do and how we do the research that we do. And one of the things that's so powerful about your work, Gerald, is that you are bringing in the community, right? But at the same time, you're just not going in, you're not thinking about it from the standpoint of, I have to get tenure, I have to be promoted. And so therefore I'm gonna go into a space, I am going to collect data, then I'm gonna remove myself from that space and I'm gonna analyze these data, and then I'm gonna submit my work to journals, right? Which is, I mean, that's, we need to do that, but at the same time, look at what you're doing. You're there. You're staying in that community. They are co-researchers with you. So I think those who are involved and who develop and create the tenure promotion process need to begin to rethink what constitutes research, what constitutes valuable research. I think it's very important, right?
Yeah, I mean, I just might add to that, and I want to thank, both you and Kibiriti for your comments, and it's really young scholar activists such as Kibiriti who are really pushing universities, right? Because universities are not just neutral entities, which kind of look at the world from above, but they're very much embedded in social reality with all the racism and histories of colonialism, implicated in histories of slavery, exploitive research agendas. And we are at a moment where universities really need to be much more self-reflective, right? And we don't have a choice, because a lot of the community-based organizations that we partner with in Philadelphia, kind of taking their cue from the disability rights movement, they're saying nothing about us without us, And I think so. This is really, reckoning throughout all of society, coming to grips, with our history, and I think for, to a large degree in university. So for example, at the University of Pennsylvania, there's a lot of, and this was really led by students, and then first community activists and then students. But there is a movement now for Penn to pay something called pilots, which is payment in lieu of taxes. Because the University of Pennsylvania is a nonprofit entity, it gets away with not paying property taxes, even though it's the wealthiest landowner, private landowner in Philadelphia. And that's money that would go into the public school system. So here we have a situation where we have a world-renowned university, and I'm proud of Penn. I'm proud of its research and teaching mission. Don't get me wrong, but it's constructing all these new buildings and expanding and gentrifying neighborhoods, displacing people, right? And blocks away, we have shuttered public schools,
The same is true in Richmond. We have the exact same dynamic happening in Richmond, largest university in the state, in the downtown city center. Not really though they're not a taxpayer, though they are a drain on the local infrastructure. So yeah.
And these cities have enabled the universities to thrive, right? So these are, and when people want example of structural racism, that's an example of structural racism, because the school district of Philadelphia serves predominantly Black, brown, and immigrant children, and so we have to, University of Pennsylvania also has its own police force, right? But maybe not enough counselors for students who are going through difficult times. And so these are some fundamental questions, we really educators have to ask ourselves. And, Stanley, Professor Trent, I really appreciate one of the things you're saying is we all have to be self-reflexive about the ways in which all our institutions are complicit, in these oppressive legacies.
Oh, yes.
I think one other part that I will just add on to that is, in this conversation where we're talking about, let's just say cultural diversity or diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism, like it all gets jumbled up all together and somehow doesn't even mean anything anymore. And I think that, we have to be careful as stewards of this work that we are cognizant of and protective of the spaces and places where we're trying to impact outcome and not allow that discourse to become like bastardized to the extent that it doesn't mean anything anymore. And so we've got to be protective of that. And that happens in education, right? So like right now, equity is the sexy new thing in education that everyone wants to tag it on to something so they can get attention. They want to tag it onto their grant so they can get funded. They want to make it the flashing thing on their documents and et cetera. And I think we have to really, as the stewards of this work, we need to be vocal about our intention, our focus, and our desired outcomes that we're seeking, right? To make sure that there continues to be alignment to those outcomes. The difference between equality and equity, even understanding what we're talking about, right? Because when we talk about equity, we're talking about outcomes. We're not talking about inputs, we're talking about the outputs. Are the outputs equitable? Are they producing outputs in an equitable way that's like dispersed equitably amongst the population? When we see disproportionality, we know that that's not true. When we see great deals of difference, not in the pass rates, but in the failure rates, look at failure rates. If you want to see inequity, start looking at the failure rates, and then you'll start to see that the percentages of failure by student groups doesn't match their representation in the student population whatsoever. We did an analysis one time where we looked at students who were pass advanced in 3rd grade on their math SOL, and were they still pass advanced in 8th grade when they took their 8th grade math SOL. And we looked at that data by race, and oh gosh, what's the statistic word? See, I'm not in the academy, so I can't think of the word. But the word, we adjusted for other variables like socioeconomic status, English language status, immigrant status, all the different things that could potentially impact it, so that, all things created equal, Black student, white student with no other characteristic, pass advance in 3rd grade, where are you in 8th grade? Well, of those students who were pass advance in 3rd grade, by the time they got to 8th grade, the failure rate of those students who were pass advance in 3rd grade for Black students was twice that of white students. What happened?
Mm-hmm.
How did you go from being pass advanced in 3rd grade to by the time you were in 8th grade, if you're a Black student, you are twice as likely to now be failing? What is going on, right? And so like part of our work as public policymakers is to ask that question. Part of your work as the academy is to help us figure out what's actually happening so that we can design interventions that will change the course of those outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's really, from my perspective, what our work is, to disrupt and dismantle systemic inequity in a system like public education.
Mm-hmm.
And that we also acknowledge that conversation around like cultural diversity is not the same conversation around racial inequity.
Mm-hmm.
Those are two different things. And we need to look at them as different things, and we need to communicate about them in different ways because they are unique and different. I think that when it comes to talking about like cultural and linguistic differences and diversity, our biggest focus needs to be a shift away from deficit framing around what is needed to support those individuals in their lifelong success, to asset-based framing of what they're bringing to the table that can support their successful self-sufficiency long-term, right? Like that's a difference. Like that's a key pillar of how we address those issues. But when we're talking about racial inequity, right? And we're talking about racism, that looks really different. And those systems that perpetuate that are very deeply entrenched in every aspect of American life.
Since 1619. Since 1619 and before. Now, the questions I'm getting, I think people now in our audience, they are hungry for how do we translate theory and policy into practice? What can they do in their settings to bring to fruition what it is that we're telling them that we want them to do? Do you all have any specific examples that you could share with them?
Well, I can start. So one of the things that we did at the Department of Education, for example, is one, we defined equity, right? Very clear definition of what does it mean for us. We established how we're going to measure it and monitor our progress. When it came to the inputs that we think are going to impact the outputs we're looking at, we gathered research, we read every book, well, not every book. We had comprehensive literature reviews of what the literature says related to cultural proficiency. One of the pillars of our work is that we believe that increasing the cultural proficiency of Virginia's educator workforce must happen in order to achieve equity and education outcomes in the Commonwealth. And so to facilitate that, we said we need to define this. So we crafted 4 profiles. What does the profile of a culturally competent educator look like? What is the profile of a culturally competent school leader? What is the profile of a culturally relevant classroom? And what is culturally relevant teaching and pedagogy actually look like for Virginia? That is Virginia specific. From there, we're creating other tools that align to those profiles that will help school leaders, teachers, educators do things like audit their curriculum, audit their instructional resources, look at different ways of conducting teacher evaluation that measures and monitors cultural proficiency efficacy in the delivery of instruction, right? So we're trying to assist the field with implementing accountability metrics that align to our public policy belief about what's going to actually make a difference in terms of advancing outcomes for students.
Mm-hmm.
If I could add, if I could add to your question, I guess looking outside from like the policy aspect, for me as like a student, is the accountability aspect of the community to hold the school system and the state accountable for being anti-racist, because to me, equity comes with just anti-racism. You have to be anti-racist. You cannot have equity without anti-racism. And so what I see, I can use Williamsburg as an example, where we see students are calling in every day to get the superintendent of the school to realize that racism is happening within the Williamsburg, James City County public school system. So how can a community rise up and hold school accountable when they're not meeting those goals set up by the state, for example? And realizing, and teachers have to realize that accountability, it's a benefit, an asset. When community rise up and say, we want this anti-racism program, we want funding for like training to be a culturally competent teacher and so on. And so I really want to push on that accountability aspect, that it could look very different in different communities, but we've got to realize that accountability is a very, very important aspect in achieving equity, because if nobody stands up and speak up about anti-racism within our school systems, then the system just going to continue perpetuating and keep going forth the way it was meant to be.
Joe, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just, I really appreciate those insights. And just to add a little bit to that, I mean, one of the kind of, I think, paradoxes of schooling and also just being an educator is that schooling is really a mechanism of social reproduction, of reproducing, inequity, reproducing racism. At the same time, and so many families, like my own family, and for the families I work with in South Philadelphia, education is still one of the primary, not the only one, right, but one of the primary vehicles for self-determination, for both individuals and communities, and for, as community members said, hope. I think what I've learned from so many of the families that I worked with is what's so important, and I think this builds off the comment of Kibiriti of communities rising, is really creating networks of care and support, right? So our work has gone on for 10 years now. Young children that we worked with, have now, like 100% who have been involved in the project, gone on to college and gone on to universities. And now they're leaders on the research side, right? And it's kind of like homegrown leadership. And there's almost like this ripple effect where, they're creating new groups around college equity and access, community-based support groups. And so when young people are in school or when they're in their first year of college and really encountering adversity, they have a whole network of support to draw from, and to overcome the obstacles, that they're facing. So they're not waiting for institutions and schoolings to change. They're creating the sense of collective agency and support to overcome these obstacles, while the world catches up to their profound vision.
Mm. And how would you describe the progress when they're going up against a system that is not changing? And you're saying that they're doing all of these things, Gerald. So, what impact is that having within the community when we're not getting, when there's not a lack of understanding about systemic racism among those people who are developing the policies, who are,
I think it's, I don't want to make necessarily too much of a binary between the school and the community, the university and the community. I mean, I think what they're doing is they're really finding kindred spirits, right? Within all these institutional locations, to be part of like a greater network of support and trying to develop a critical mass of people, who have critical perspectives on education and who really have the relational, I absolutely believe like relational labor is intellectual labor, and, looking for people who are putting in the time and creating those really supportive relationships based on solidarity, based on mutual respect and love, and really based on viewing everyone as a knowledge producer, and I think that's a really important piece of it. But there always seems to be a certain wall you hit, like there always seems to be a certain level where power just feels like it's intransigent, where someone is making decisions, you know, behind closed doors without any transparency. And I think that's very challenging.
I think though that I'm feeling very optimistic today, which is not always the case because when you do this work, it's sometimes hard to stay optimistic. But I'm feeling very optimistic today. Today we accomplished something at the Department of Education that is probably one of the most, you know, things that I am most proud of being a part of in terms of my professional career. And that is that our State Board of Education approved today the recommendations of the African American History Education Commission to incorporate nearly 100 pages of technical edits to the Virginia History and Social Science Standards to tell more completely, honestly, truthfully, the contributions and true history of African Americans and their contribution to this country. And that was a battle, believe it or not, right? Like everybody didn't think that was the right thing to do, or that it shouldn't be done now, right? Like that we could take more time to do this. There's gonna be a press release on this today, y'all. Just wait, it's coming. I see little chats over there. We're very, very excited about this, but when we talk about like that wall, right, and the decision makers and the power holders and the influencers, what's really critically important in this work is that one, we know and acknowledge that it is not easy. And that in order to advance equity in systems and structures, that means it's gonna cost something. There is a cost to doing that, right? Because others are benefiting off a system of oppression. So when you start to dismantle systems of oppression, those who are reaping the benefits of that are starting to feel a loss. So there is a cost to doing this work. And the other thing is that 2020 positions us uniquely, where there is this public policy window that has opened to a new national discourse that we have never engaged in an authentic and honest way about the implications of what is called systemic racism, not racism as in a person to a person, but the systemic prevalence of racism across every aspect of American society. We're having that real authentic conversation now. And in spaces and places like Virginia and like the Department of Education, we are able to have these conversations in honest ways that we haven't been able to do in the past. We're able to call things racism that are racism. We're allowed to say, you know what, that's actually just racism. That's not implicit bias.
Yes.
You don't need to make it have this nice, pretty name so everybody feels good about it. That's actually just racism. So let's just not do that anymore. And so we're able to start having these conversations, and we have people in positions and places and spaces. I'm not going to attribute this quote to the person who said it because everybody here knows that person, so I'm not going to attribute it to them without their permission. But I was recently talking to a colleague, African-American educator, very well known in the state, and we were talking about this work around the standards, right, to change the history and social science standards, and how there were individuals who were attempting to mount a legal campaign against the board taking action on these recommendations off cycle, right? And that's a tactic, right, to utilize the legal system to continue to perpetuate oppression and racism in systems. And it was really poignant though what she said to me, because she said, well, they got lawyers, we got lawyers now too. And that's the thing, right? So while we may still be facing some of those same institutional challenges that existed 20, 30, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 100 years ago, if you saw Antebellum, you know what I'm talking about. We might still be facing those same challenges, but the players are positioned differently today than they have ever been. And that is where we're able to make impact. So yes, decisions are being made behind closed doors, but sometimes there's a person like me who gets to go behind that door. And it's exhausting, it's tiring, like I got knife wounds in my back, I promise. But we're positioned differently, right? Like those of us who want to see a more just society are positioned differently today than we were 50, 100 years ago. So I am optimistic, and we don't leave with nothing else. Let's be optimistic today, because today is a win for Virginia. It's a win for education equity, and it's a day that we should all be celebrating.
I love it. I love the fact that you are optimistic. And one of the things that I talk to my students about, because we look at these two, we consider being idealistic and being a realist as, polar opposites. And I tell my students that I am a hopeful realist, because just like you said, Leah, this is tough work. How do you dismantle something that started 400 years ago? So you have to understand that it's never going away, that but you maintain hope and you continue to fight for that change, for that systemic change that will make this a more equitable society. And Gerald.
To my quick comment on optimism, and one of the things that makes me optimistic, in addition to everything Leah said, is that we hear a lot about polarization and division, but in the community work that I do, people are coming together across boundaries. We have, the historic African-American community self-identified in South Philadelphia with new immigrant communities. We have people who are undocumented, who don't have papers, working with people who have citizenship. We have communities that in their home countries were persecuted by, they perceive communists, and those who are red tagged as communists, all coming together for a greater vision for their children, right? And for every story there is of division, there are many, many stories of coalition and of solidarity that we don't always hear about.
Yes, I was going to say we need to make sure that those are acknowledged and received. Wow, folks, it is 4:58. And I just think that this has been an incredible hour, and I thank the panelists so much for sharing with us their work, their insights, and their hopes for the future. One of the things that I'll end with is Gerald, what you said is that you talked about the whole issue of the notion of kindred spirits. I think that's a great way to end that, not to see things from the standpoint of binary, but seeking out those people in different positions at the State Department, at the universities, in the community, who can come together with goals, shared goals, to bring about change. So I thank you so much, and I hope that we can continue this conversation. I have your emails. You'll be hearing from me. Ben, did you want to close us out?
Yeah, I think wow is the word, Stan. You said it. And I just wanted to say thank you to Leah, to Kibiriti, to Gerald, and to you, Stan, for leading us through this conversation, for sharing. Leah, such exciting news from your camp. Thanks for sharing that with our audience here today. We just wanted to thank the UVA School of Education and Human Development as well for their support and collaboration in building this week of programs that we've just been through, focused around education and equity in it. So all 5 of those events were recorded, including this one, and will be available on our YouTube channel. So spread the message, share the word. We have 2 more weeks left in Cities Rising, this series that we've been together in this fall. Next week is focused on data and how it can be an ally, and some of the kinds of community collaborations that were discussed today. So we hope that you'll join us for future sessions. We hope that you'll consider becoming a contributing member to our foundation. And thank you again to all our panelists, and we hope you all have a wonderful evening.